Good afternoon. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and absolutely delighted to welcome everyone here today. Let me first specifically identify Nikolai Ratiu, president of the Ratiu Family Foundation, Ukraine's ambassador to the U.S., Georgia's ambassador to the U.S., Montenegro's ambassador to the U.S., the U.S. ambassador to Slovakia, Theodore Sedgwick, and members of the Ratiu family and others connected with this award. Mrs. Ratiu, how are you? It's such a pleasure to introduce today's workshop with Mustafa Nayyem, the 10th recipient of the Ion Ratiu Democracy Award. I also want to give a particular warm welcome to Ambassador Toria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. She's a dear personal friend, and she's made a very special effort to join us on one of the world's most busy days. Toria and I were at the Munich Security Conference last weekend, where the focus was Ukraine. I guess Nikolai, our honoree was there too. I think he was. Were you there? Were you in Munich? No, you weren't. Yes, you were. Yes, you were. I moderated a panel there with President Petro Poroshenko and the presidents of Lithuania, Bulgaria, and Finland. It was a truly terrifying experience. Toria worked all over the place, including behind the scenes with Secretary of State Kerry, Vice President Joe Biden, and many, many others to set up a crucial series of meetings that have been playing out this week. I think you all know that Chancellor Merkel was in Washington on Monday. I had the good fortune to see her again when she was here. I'm sure that Toria saw her as well. And just yesterday, this is playing out right now in the news cycle, the leaders of Ukraine, France, Germany, and Russia announced another ceasefire, which is set to begin at midnight on Saturday. But major issues remain unresolved. The good news is that if the ceasefire occurs, heavy weapons are to be withdrawn at least 15 miles from the front lines to ensure the security of Ukraine's civilians who have been pummeled in this war that Russia says it is not conducting. But there's also bad news. Ukraine still lacks meaningful control of its border with Russia, and Russia, reports say, insisted that this issue be postponed until later in the year. Many in this country, and many of them were in Munich over the weekend, feel we should supply Ukraine with defensive weapons, jamming equipment, surveillance drones, and anti-tank missiles. But leaders and scholars in Europe, and especially Chancellor Merkel, as well as some of the leaders and scholars at the Wilson Center in our Kennan Institute, worry that arms would only provoke more aggressive Russian action. How this will play out remains unclear, but what's crucial is that the fighting in eastern Ukraine stop and that President Poroshenko implement promptly the reform agenda that was so central to the Maidan revolution. Individuals like Mustafa Nayyem, a journalist and member of the Rada, the Ukraine parliament, are on the front lines of this effort and will make the decisive difference. That's why he so deserves today's award. Shortly, Mustafa will deliver a keynote for this event on consolidating Ukraine's democratic gains. Christian Osterman, who's right here, the director of the Wilson Center's Global Europe program, will lead that conversation. We'll also hear later from scholars and friends of Ukraine what the world at large can contribute to Ukraine's reform and security. That panel will be chaired by Kennan Institute Director Matt Rajansky, who is over in the corner. First, though, it is a matter of enormous personal pleasure to introduce Ambassador Toria Nuland, Assistant Secretary of State, as I mentioned, for European and Eurasian Affairs, a seasoned diplomat, just 2 sentences, and former ambassador to NATO. Toria is a key architect of U.S. policy on Ukraine and a true friend to its growing democracy. She and her brilliant historian husband, Bob Kagan, are just wonderful supporters of the broader Washington community that cares so much about issues like this. And please join me in welcoming Toria Nuland.
Thank you, Jane. What an honor to be here today at the Wilson Center. I am not the least bit surprised to find that Wilson has just been named one of the top 10 think tanks and the best managed in Washington under Jane's spectacular leadership. Among other things, this is a bipartisan think tank, and that's a rare thing here in Washington, and we are delighted to support all the work you've done, as we were delighted to work with you when you were in the Congress for 2 decades. Jane is indeed not just a great supporter of democracy around the world. She is a wonderful personal friend and has been a mentor to me for many, many years, so I'm delighted to be here with her. I can think of no better person to welcome into the community of Ion Ratiu Democracy Award winners than Mustafa Nayyem today. And Mustafa, it's quite an auspicious company, as you know, including Angela Kotsu, Oleg Kozlovsky of Russia, Aung San Suu Kyi, but nobody deserves it this year more than Mustafa. A little bit about his background. You know his story, but I'll tell it again. He was born in Laghman, Afghanistan. He ended up in Kiev with his Afghan father and Iranian mother when he was 11, went to university there. He's now 33, the same age his father was when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. He had a 10-year journalistic career before becoming a deputy in the Rada, first with Context Media, then with Ukrainska Pravda. Then he was the anchor, handsome anchor of Today the Main, and the founder of the premier digital TV station in Ukraine, Hromadska TV. He's also was a 2010 participant in the State Department's International Visitor Program for journalists that brings journalists from around the world to the United States to meet their fellow journalists and to see how we do it here and to make connections that we hope will last for a lifetime professionally. And then in 2014, he spent the summer at Stanford as a member of the Stanford Summer Fellowship. You all know Mustafa most as the man who is called the spark that lit the Maidan. Just to tell that story, for those of you who don't already know it by heart, on November 21st, 2013, shortly after former Ukrainian President Yanukovych decided to postpone Ukraine's path to Europe and association, Mustafa got on his Facebook page at around 8 o'clock at night and posted, "Come on, guys, let's be serious. If you really want to do something about this, don't just like this post, write that you are ready and that we can try and start something." Within an hour, over 600 comments had been received on his page. The message was simple: "Me hotovi," we are ready, in Ukrainian, of course. So Mustafa put up a second post. "Let's meet at 10:30 near the Monument to Independence in the middle of Maidan." And the Maidan movement was born, and Ukraine set off on its path to a more democratic, more dignified, more European future. But Mustafa did not stop there. He did not stop there, simply ensuring that the Maidan lasted, that democracy came to Ukraine. He had personal experience. He had thought for quite a while about what it means to take responsibility for a protest movement. And he knew that protest movements often fizzle because those who are on the barricades do not then take responsibility for the politics that follows when they have the chance. But not Mustafa. He decided that he would do his part to change the politics, to change the economics of his country. He decided to run on the Poroshenko ticket for the Rada and to continue his political activism. Even during the political campaign, he was fighting for that clean, democratic future that Ukrainians want and deserve. He even helped expose some dirty campaigns and dirty money going into the election before the vote was even finished. He was, of course, elected, and he is now a deputy in the new Rada. And already in the Rada, he has been a champion for all the things that he stood on the Maidan for and that he's spoken about since, particularly fighting corruption, particularly giving Ukrainians a dignified future. He likes to say he's in the system, but not of the system. He has already protested against the low salaries that public officials are paid in Ukraine, which is just an open door to corruption as people try to make ends meet. He has protested against kickbacks by customs officials. He also protested against and worked against in the Rada the first concept of this Ministry of Information that came forward. It's now been modified by the Rada to be more of a public information ministry. But the fact that Mustafa spoke out and called it Orwellian woke people up in Ukraine that there was a risk of going backwards. And today, he is one of the founders of one of the most important movements inside the Ukrainian Rada, the Interfaction Group, which calls itself the Group of Euro-Optimists. I think anybody who's worked with parliaments or been in parliament knows that nothing happens if you can't work across the aisle, if you can't build coalitions. Mustafa is now not just talking that talk, he is walking that walk. And a new generation of Ukrainian politicians is being born who is working for a broad base of support for the reforms that have to happen. Well, Jane, you have always had impeccable political timing, but what a day to have this event, that on the morning that we all woke up to see the very good news that thanks to the superb diplomacy by Chancellor Merkel, President Hollande of France and their teams. There was last night signed by the Trilateral Contact Group, Ukraine, Russia, and the separatists, a new agreement that offers the chance of a true ceasefire, a true pullback, appropriate democratic politics in the east of Ukraine, and a return of full Ukrainian sovereignty, particularly on the border. We strongly welcome this agreement. As with all things, the devil will be in the details and in the implementation, beginning, we all hope, this weekend at 00 Sunday night when the ceasefire is to be put in place. Ukraine needs peace. Ukraine deserves peace. Ukraine needs the time to restore dignity, to restore reform, to answer those voices on the Maidan, for politicians, you're a politician now, like Mustafa, to do their work. But I can think of no greater proof that the Wilson Center has chosen the right man for this year's award than to quote for you what Mustafa put up on his Facebook page this morning when he woke up in Washington rather than in Kyiv to hear the news. He chose to quote Lincoln's second inaugural, Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural. And here's what he wrote, using Lincoln's words: "We hope with all our hearts and fervently pray that the war is a terrible disaster, ended as soon as possible." I hope you will all join me in saying amen to that, and congratulations to Mustafa Nayyem.
You can get up.
Thank you very much. I'm a little bit nervous because I didn't expect so many people come to this event. And actually, it's my first speech I wrote because I was worked before that in TV and I didn't need some, marks, but I did it for today. So first of all, I'm honored to receive this award. It so happened that it coincided with the beginning of my career as a politician. And I'm sure that in the future it will remain my lodestar. Okay, as far as we're talking about democracy in Ukraine, I will describe you what we had just 2 years ago. 2 years ago, one morning, me and my several friends and colleagues, journalists and activists, we woke up in the morning and met in our office, and we decided to write the message to our parliamentarians. We took a big piece of paper and appeal to the member of our parliament. Our message contained very simple and clear thing. We wanted Parliament to follow the procedures and adopt legislation about freedom access to public information. We transmitted this poster to the Parliament, and believe me, it was not a very simple task, because by our rules it was forbidden for journalists to bring into the Parliament any posters. So we asked one of the friendly members of our Parliament to do it for us, and he literally carried it to the Parliament smuggling. At the start of the Parliament session, we put this poster on the balcony where journalists were seated, but this victory lasts just 10 minutes, because in 10 minutes, Parliament guard took our posters off, and we were warned that the next time we will not be allowed into the Parliament. But we were persist, and as far as me and my colleague, Sergei Leshchenko, we were all well-known journalists in Ukraine. We can allow ourselves something more than other journalists. So we still managed to repeat this action for several times. But during 4 years of presidency of Viktor Yanukovych, our achievements still were not impressive. We only had 2 victories. We passed through a law on access to public information, and only one time, we were able to prevent a breach of parliamentary procedure. We had weak civil society. Almost no one listened to us, and we had only a few members of parliament who was loyal to us, and we thought and considered that it our greatest achievement that we have some friends inside the parliament. Laws were adopted without any discussions and breaking all possible procedures. What we have now? You know that by the results of last parliament elections, a lot of activists, journalists, and young people entered the parliament. And 2 months ago, we had very, very important hearings in parliament. We were to elect boardroom of parliament and parliament committees. But during this voting, one of the former colleagues, journalist, sent us a video from the balcony, and this video was evident that one of the pro-government deputies voted not only for himself, but his colleagues too, who was absent actually in parliament. It was very important voting, and we had just little violation of parliament procedures. And all those old-fashioned politicians asked us, please, just don't listen to them, just go ahead. But me and several of our young colleagues decided that it's our first challenge in this parliament, and we can't allow it to happen again. To be honest, at that moment, we were not sure that we were strong enough to do something. We were only 3 of us. It was me, my colleague Sergei Leshchenko, and my other colleague, beautiful Svetlana Zalishuk. I think you know her. So we decided to start this movement, and we went to the tribune and blocked it and stopped the work of parliament. And we impressed how many of our colleagues supported this initiative. In a few moments, almost 100 members of parliament, also old politicians, were near us, were beside of us, and they supported this initiative. And we stopped eventually the session and forced the new parliament to hold a fair vote on this issue. From the day, violation of the rule of personal voting repeated just a few more times, but today it is very rare in our parliament. This is just a small example of changes in the country over the last year, but it's not only about procedure. And changes have affected not only parliament. After Maidan, voices of civil society became extremely loud and sometimes threatening to politicians. Under pressure of activists and with the help of NGOs, only for 2 months, we also adopted package of anti-corruption legislation which will take effect next month. First time in the country's history, officials and politicians will be obliged to declare not only their incomes, but expenses. Violations of this law carry a punishment up 5 years imprisonment. We expect that over time, this package will radically change the investigation of the corruption in civil service. We also developed, and now we are preparing for adoption of legislation to create anti-corruption bureau. It will be the first state agency focusing on investigation corruption of high-ranked officials. The head of this body will be chosen by independent experts and prominent leaders of NGOs. To date, one of the
potential head of this agency can become Mikhail Saakashvili. I think you've heard about that fact, former president of Georgia. We hope so, but it's not fact. It's not for record. Just it's our measurements. So we also adopted amendment to the law which regulates activity of joint stock companies. This amendment prevents the possibility of fraud with the state shares in joint stock companies. Those who are familiar with the situation in Ukraine, they understand how historical and important is that step. And it will change relations between oligarchs in our country and state companies. Also, during first 3 months of new parliament, we managed to open access to the declarations of all deputies and their assistants. We eliminated so-called moral commission. It was done just 3 days ago, which actually this body was a remnant of Soviet past and is often used for covert censorship. And as you know, one of our last victory is resignation of Attorney General, who has not fulfilled his promises to investigate crimes committed during the Maidan. These days, for the first time during maybe last years, Parliament is able to enforce its own agenda upon all bureaucratic machine, including government and president. But all those big and small success we have achieved are possible only due to the fact that finally in the Parliament appeared new forces, young people who believe that they can change something without link to the capitals, with the oligarchs and with old politicians. Meanwhile, democracy in Ukraine still have lots of threats. After Maidan, we encountered two powerful armies which hinder our movement toward the new Ukraine. First, obviously, it is war. War in the east border of our country, which is supported by the real troops and tanks of foreign country. I don't think it is necessary to explain for you how it's complicated and difficult to build a liberal country when you have war in your border. Ilovaisk, Volnovakha, Mariupol, Debaltseve, and now you know Kramatorsk. You pronounce those names of these cities with bitterness. Numbers of killed and injured of our soldiers and civilians became a part of our daily life. Today, almost every meeting of our parliament starts with a minute of silence in honor of next victims in the front. It's every hearings of parliament. Just imagine that. Military slogans and patriotic mottos, speeches have become commonplace in our life. But unfortunately, we encountered a variety of politicians and oligarchs who shout those slogans to skulk behind the war and maintain the status quo. And bright mottos make much more complicated to fight the resistance of the system. Those false patriots, thousands of officials and many old-fashioned politicians, Soviet-style individuals, they are second big army who threatened democracy in Ukraine now, today. In fact, we are now fighting on two fronts, against the external enemy, and you know who is that, and inner enemy. We have in Kiev and other cities, and with the inner demons inside our country, we should fight politically. And sometimes inner enemies look not less dangerous, and I'm not sure they are conscious how effective they assist our external enemies. Oligarchs in their strong alliances with the politicians and with the political elite make us much weaker. To my great regret, most politicians in our country were not ready to burn bridges with oligarchs past after Maidan. I do not call names of those politicians not because I'm afraid, but because I don't know them. I don't know who are going to fight oligarchs in our country. And it appeared that to fight for changes several months is much easier to bring new standards in the real life daily. It was easy to stay on Maidan. It's much more difficult to be in parliament and to fight for those values. Unfortunately, our elites, all of them, they had a great chance, leave mark in history as the pioneers of anti-oligarch crusade of New Ukraine. But they missed the chance to declare this war inside the country. We can argue why it happened. Maybe because of war, due to the weakness of the politicians themselves, or simply because of lack of courage. But eventually, it did not happen. Now you know that a lot of members of our parliament, they linked to different oligarchs. It's not secret. And those oligarchs, they are not paying taxes to our budget, but this budget is for army and for those soldiers who are dying on our front line. How fast can we deliver these changes? I'm confident that the current parliament and government in Ukraine are transitional. Engine of the new standards is not leadership and initiative of the previous generation of politicians, but the fear of public indignation. Our politicians, they're afraid of streets, they're afraid of protests, they're afraid of public opinion. Eventually, it's very good signals for us because we can push them to do what we want and what society wants during Maidan, not the things they want. A small group of young people who enter the parliament is just the tip of the iceberg under which boils large and active civil society and young people who are ready to replace the current politicians. And I'm convinced that one of the most important mission of our team, Euro optimists and young people in the parliament, is to create this social elevator for new energy, strength, and inspiration. Traditions of new political culture in Ukraine are setting right now, at this moment, because a lot of our colleagues now sitting in the parliament, fighting, sometimes physically, fighting against corruption, and it happens on your eyes. You can see it on your TV, you can read it on Ukrainska Pravda, and etc. And we made Maidan on the streets of Ukraine, but we should make this Maidan on the corridors of power. We should start it, maybe next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa, for your passionate and inspiring remarks. And congratulations on the Ion Ratiu Democracy Award. I'm Christian Osterman. As Jane Harman mentioned, I direct the Global Europe program here at the center and chair the Ion Ratiu Award, the annual award. I apologize for President Harman and Ambassador Newland, who had to leave immediately following their remarks. Before introducing our panel, let me just say a few words about the award itself. The Ion Ratiu Democracy Award aims to bring international recognition to the ideas and accomplishments of individuals around the world who are working on behalf of democracy, on behalf of democratic change. The event commemorates the deep commitment to democracy of the late Ion Ratiu through his contributions as a Romanian citizen, Romanian politician, and as well as his activism on behalf of democracy. As a young Romanian democracy activist in the 1970s and 80s, Ion Ratiu's time here in Washington proved to be a life-changing experience, and therefore this is a right place to honor him. The award is supported by the Ratiu Family Charitable Foundation, established in 1979, organized in cooperation with the Ratiu Democracy Center in Turda. This is the 10th Ion Ratiu Award, as President Harman mentioned, and we're very grateful to the Ratiu Foundation for their partnership on support. And we have with us today Nikolai Ratiu, one of Ion Ratiu's two sons, who is here with us today along with his wife, Sasha, and we appreciate their presence. I also would like to recognize Professor Elliot Sorrell, who serves as a senior advisor to the award and has been enormously helpful to the center over the years. Our thanks go to the distinguished experts who are joining Mustafa and me on the panel, and then later in the second panel that Matt Rojansky will chair, to the Kennan Institute, which is co-sponsoring this event, and also to my assistant Emily Buss, and her team of interns who has been helping to organize this event. Now, we will proceed in the following way. I will introduce the speakers on the first panel, which deals with post-revolution democratic consolidation, looking at the internal aspects. Then our speakers will give brief statements, 10, 15 minutes or so. We'll give Mustafa a chance to respond, and then open it up, I hope, very quickly to your questions and comments. We'll go until 3, or shortly before 3, take a break, and then have a second panel that looks at Ukraine and the world with another very distinguished set of speakers. We'll end around 5 o'clock, and then I invite all of you to reception across the hall in our boardroom. Mustafa has already been introduced by the ambassador, so I will forgo any further words on him. Let me just introduce our 3 other panelists. Oleg Kozlovsky, here to my immediate left, is a Moscow-based civic activist, blogger, and researcher. He received a Master's of Arts in Political Science from the Higher School of Economics and continued his education at Stanford University and as a Fulbright researcher at George Washington University. His area of research includes nonviolent resistance, popular movements, and colored revolutions in Eastern Europe. Himself an activist, Oleg was one of the leading members of democratic groups, including Oborona, the Other Russia Coalition, and so forth, and was involved in the democratic movement before, during, and after the 2011-2012 protests. In 2010, he founded Vision of Tomorrow, a Moscow-based NGO dedicated to strengthening the Russian civil society through training and support of a new generation of activists. For his activism at home and abroad, he has been jailed a number of times, illegally drafted into the army, declared persona non grata by 2 authoritarian governments, and he, we're proud to say, received the International Human Rights Award and the 2010 Ion Ratiu Democracy Award, and it's wonderful to have you back, Oleg, here at the center. We then go to Corinna Rebegea, who is a resident fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CIPA, where she leads the center's Romania program. She completed her MPA degree at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs as a Fulbright scholar with a focus on leadership, public, and nonprofit management. She's always been interested in national and international politics, rule of law development, and public sector leadership, and has pursued those interests at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung's Rule of Law program, Southeast Europe, and as an active member of the Romanian NGO community. In her previous capacity, Corinna managed and supervised projects dealing with justice reform, human rights, and leadership. And we're delighted to have her here and to give us a perspective from one of Ukraine's neighbors. Finally, another one that we can now call our own, Alexander Zaitsev, who graduated from the history faculty of the Ivan Franko Lviv State University in 1986. From 87 to 2004, he worked at the Department of History, the Ukrainian State University of Forestry and Wood Technology, as a laboratory assistant, assistant lecturer, and senior lecturer. Since 2004, he's been associate professor at the Department of Modern History of Ukraine at Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. He has served as head of the department. In May 2014, he defended his dissertation on Ukrainian integral nationalism of the 1920s and 30s at the Institute of Ukrainian Studies at the National Academy of the Sciences of Ukraine. He currently is a Fulbright scholar here at the Wilson Center. Delighted that all of you can join us, and I'll turn it over to Oleg.
Thank you, Christian. Dear Mustafa, dear guests, it's my honor to speak here, and it's great to be here again after receiving this award 4 years ago. And the situation now is quite different from what it was like in 2010. It is different for Ukraine, it is different for Russia, and the last year or year and a few months, I think it has been, it has felt like a dream, sometimes a nightmare, sometimes a beautiful dream, but unfortunately I think more of the former than the latter to many people in Ukraine and in Russia. And since Mustafa published his Facebook post that Ambassador Nuland quoted here, Ukraine basically jumped into a river where it can't stop, it can't go back, it just has to go through until the end, and it has to either win, to either survive in this quest for democracy, freedom, and peace, or it will fail, and this will have any of these outcomes will have long-term impact for the entire region. It will not be an exaggeration to say that if Ukraine fails, then we will see the entire former Soviet region fall into the hands of Putin, and we will see Russia restore or create its sphere of interests that will not only include Ukraine, but will include most of the former Soviet countries, perhaps with the exception of Baltics, but we can't be sure for how long. And it will undermine all attempts to democratize these Eastern European and Eurasian countries in the years to come. If Ukraine manages to become a democratic, free, and peaceful country, it will deal a devastating blow to the ideology that Putin has been promoting in his country and in the region, saying that democracy, Western democracy, as they put it, is incompatible with the Russian or the Soviet mentality, that it can't be established, that it can only be established with the use of force by foreign powers. And if we see Ukraine succeed with its experiment, with this unfortunately very tragic experiment that has already cost thousands of people their lives, then these sacrifices will not be in vain, and then we can see in the next years the crumbling of the system established in the last decade and a half in Russia, in Belarus, in other post-Soviet countries. The problem, of course, is that, as Mustafa has mentioned, Ukraine still has a lot of its internal problems that it has to solve at the same time as it's fighting the war in its eastern parts. And we were asked to talk mainly about Ukrainian domestic developments, but as the only person, as the only Russian person in this panel, I think I should make a few comments about the agreement that was signed last night in Minsk. I think, well, there is a saying in Russian that a good piece is a bad piece is better than a good war. it may be this case, but I'm not sure. The agreement is certainly flawed, and what I expect is that at best it will return the situation to what we had last fall, when there was some sort of ceasefire that was never fully observed. There were no massive assaults or advances by either party, but there was also no genuine peace process. If we look at the text, there are many things that have been obviously put into it to prevent the agreement from being fulfilled. We can't expect local elections to actually take place in the eastern Ukraine, according to this new law, because it's subject to negotiations with the separatists, who are obviously not interested to be demoted from the czars of their local small republics to being simply public officials within the political and legal system of Ukraine. Then, since I don't think we will see these elections happen, we will not see Ukraine restore control over the border, because these two issues are connected in the agreement, and it means that Russia will still be able to bring as many troops or as many armament it wishes at any moment. And since Russia has been quite successful at undermining OSCE monitoring work in the separatist-controlled areas, there will be no effective monitoring of ceasefire. So I wouldn't expect too much from this agreement, but I think it is still a chance for Ukraine, because in the end of the day, whether this is a good development or a bad development will depend on whether Ukraine manages to use this time they have won to improve its situation, to improve its strategic position, to conduct the reforms, to prevent the economical meltdown. And then, after this agreement, I'm afraid, inevitably fails, we will see if Ukraine has got stronger, if Ukraine has got more stable, if Ukraine has managed to solve the issues that prevent it from being effective today, or whether Russia has managed to do that. And I would wish, of course, a lasting peace to take place in Ukraine. But I think, like I said, this agreement is not going to affect this, because neither of the sides gets what it wants with the agreement. Ukraine wants to restore its territorial integrity, and this agreement, although in words does reiterate Russia's and all other countries' support for territorial integrity, it doesn't provide it, in fact. Putin wants to establish his sphere of interests and wants to control Ukraine, either directly or indirectly, and the agreement doesn't provide that as well. It means that the conflict is still unresolved, and I'm afraid we're going to see, after some time, I don't know how long a time, we're going to see more fighting, and I'm afraid we're here for a long haul.
Thank you. Corinna?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to congratulate Mustafa, and I was really touched about your speech, and I really appreciate you sharing with us your assessment of where Ukraine is today with the steps that you've taken ahead, and also the threats that you see in the future. And somehow your speech reminded me of the euphoria and the enthusiasm that we've seen 25 years ago after the fall of the Berlin Wall in Central and Eastern Europe, and all the hopes that this led to in the democratic development of the region. And I was reading recently an essay about the fall of the communist regimes in the region. And the anniversary actually started with quite a disheartening observation, and that this observation is that the anniversary is marked by a sense of missed opportunity, and that perhaps the promises of this early time in the democratic development in Central and Eastern Europe and the prosperity that came, the promise of prosperity that came with it, do not match the hopes and the enthusiasm and the expectations that we had at that time. Now, I don't completely agree with that statement. It's a very general statement. And of course, the experiences across the region are very diverse, but I think it does point out to the need for more sobriety in dealing with revolutions and dealing with especially the variable of time and managing expectations when a country or an entire region is going through such a transition. And if I may, there was this somewhat very serious remark that Adam Michnik made, and that it was that the worst thing about communism is what comes after. We can say the same thing about revolutions. I hope this is not true, and I hope what comes after the Ukrainian revolution and what comes after this crisis in Central and Eastern Europe will not be the worst thing about it. Unfortunately, even countries that we've seen as champions of transition and of democratic development are no longer displaying those encouraging features. And this is something I would like to bring in the discussion, something that hopefully will benefit Ukraine's transition in the future by looking at how the countries in Central and Eastern Europe have managed their own transition. And actually the experience of the past 25 years shows that it takes a lot of commitment, time, and a lot more work than we set ourselves to at the beginning of this process. So I would like to mention three main things that have become somewhat common currency in talking about Ukraine these days. I'm not going to refer to security challenges. It's another thing. It's very important, it's crucial. In none of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, we have seen such a present threat to territorial integrity and sovereignty as we are seeing today in Ukraine, and that, of course, alters the situation. But on the other hand, the security crisis should not impede or postpone the modernization and the reform efforts. So back to the three things. The role of external anchoring in making sure the reforms are sustainable. Second, fighting corruption. And third, the need for political leadership to overcome the vested interests that have affected Ukraine so far and make the necessary shift in the governance paradigm. And they're all interconnected. But let me start with corruption. And I'm going to say something that might sound shocking. Anti-corruption laws and institutions don't work. I mean, they don't work by themselves. And they don't work immediately. And we've seen that in the experience of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe. We've seen that in particular in Romania and Bulgaria, where we've been battling this disease for more than 15 years, and only now we're starting to see results. A captured state like that of Ukraine and such entrenched corruption cannot be dealt only by establishing new anti-corruption laws and institutions. And enforcement agencies have a limited scope of action, and that scope of action is punitive, and it deals with the effects and not the causes of the problem. And as I've mentioned, the experiences in Bulgaria and Romania in particular show that in order to take root, anti-corruption reforms and in particular anti-corruption prosecutions need a lot of time. And they require reform efforts in other areas, starting from institutional reforms, for instance, with financial institutions or tax administration, reforming the entire judiciary and the entire magistracy, so on and so forth. So Ukrainians cannot really just sit around and wait until prosecutions happen. In Romania, for instance, the results, the beneficial results, I have to give credit to anti-corruption prosecutors, are only visible now, let's say 10 years after setting up a new legislative framework and a new anti-corruption agency. Then these prosecutions usually come in a very hostile political environment, and you've alluded to that. Many Ukrainian parliamentarians are still not on the right side of things. They will still try to stall the process, to maybe dismantle these institutions, to put barriers to implementing this legislation. So they will need very strong institutional guarantees. Now, in Romania and Bulgaria, these institutional guarantees were offered mainly by the EU through the cooperation and verification mechanism, which was and is somewhat of a micromanagement instrument that the EU used in these two countries, and unfortunately was not made available for Ukraine. And I say eventually because I'll come back to the external anchoring. And it will need the new anti-corruption framework will need strong public and civil society support, which I'm encouraged about by what you said and by following the events in Ukraine and this new sort of public opinion outrage against what has happened to Ukraine in the past years. So what criminal prosecutions have recently revealed in Romania, and I think this is one of the most important achievements apart from putting bad people behind bars, is the extent to which corruption has permeated all levels of state administration and the transpartisan networks and the extreme rent-seeking of public resources. So now, based on this knowledge that was revealed through anti-corruption prosecutions, we're now starting to talk about governance reforms and what is needed to prevent corruption from happening in the first place, and closing those gaps that provide the opportunities for captors, as in oligarchs, politicians, various business people, to prey on public goods and public resources. Going back to Ukraine, Ukraine can save a lot of time and make anti-corruption work by approaching it in a more integrative manner. This means dealing with the roots of the problem, dealing and altering the governance system, the way in which resources and power are accessed, distributed, and used in society. And this means a wide range of issues. I'm not going to go into details. I know a lot of steps have been taken in Ukraine, from dealing with the reform of state-owned enterprises to changing administrative rules, so on and so forth. Reforming the public sector will remain a key aspect, in particular when it comes to public sector personnel management. And here, if I may, just a comment, I'm afraid that lustration will not do the trick in cleaning the public service unless there are clear and fair rules for recruiting, training, appraising public officials and public servants. And the same goes for magistrates. I mean, the entire system will have to be reformed to bring in the right people for the job if anti-corruption is going to succeed and if the broader reforms in society are going to succeed. And if we want all this modernization efforts that you have been engaged in for the past months and hopefully for the future, will have the overhauling effect that we want them to have. And this remark about the human resources, as I said, goes to the heart of the success of the anti-corruption institutions. Independent, professional, and upright head prosecutors will make all the difference in the way investigations are conducted and in the way the public and the accused themselves will perceive the fairness of the investigations. And this should in no way be seen as victor's justice, as is always the case with transition governments. When the government changes, they bring their own justice, and then you expect that to happen again in 4, 5, or 10 years, wherever the people in power change. And maybe one last thing about how anti-corruption can fall prey to its own success. On the one hand, as I mentioned, there are always attempts to discredit or just outright dismantle these institutions. But on the other hand, bringing high-level officials to court for corruption will have a tremendous impact on public opinion. breaking that perception that the rich and the powerful are immune. In Romania, for instance, the public approval for anti-corruption prosecution service is now at 60%. I think if we wait a few more months, it will equal the public approval for the Orthodox Church, which will be amazing, of course. However, anti-corruption institutions should not be seen as the silver bullet that will fix all problems in the country's governance system, and I can't reinforce that enough. Because they won't. They won't be that silver bullet. If we're lucky, what they will do, as we've seen in Romania, as we've unfortunately only partially seen in Bulgaria or in the Czech Republic, they will just send bad guys to prison. So again, integrated approach, not a piecemeal anti-corruption that reflects and alters the entire governance system. There's probably not much left to say about political leadership outside the discussion about state capture or corruption. But I chose to single it out as one particular governance reform without which the others are not possible and will not have the desired impact. And we're always talking about the importance of political will. Now, you have the political will. Not everybody has that political will in the Ukrainian parliament or in the parliaments of other countries in the region, for that matter. But this political will can be induced and forced, even, mainly by addressing the flow of money in politics. And this is the big debate in so many Central and Eastern European countries right now. We need a transparent, clear, clean funding system for political parties combined with transparent decision-making, and this will make all the difference. Of course, this goes against entrenched interests across the board. They're shared by all political forces. But Ukraine now benefits from this wave of civic activism and support that will hopefully push for these reforms that are crucial and without which, and the experiences in the region show that very clearly, things will not happen, because this is what maintains politicians in power and their vested interests. So they're crucial, and not just because the political actors have been or have been perceived to be the main captors of the state, but also because the representative institutions are losing people's trust. And that's a worrisome trend across the region. And losing people's trust undermine the very essence of democracy. And so what Ukraine needs right now is to reestablish the legitimacy of its public institutions. And so does Romania and Bulgaria and the Czech Republic and many other countries in the region. And lastly, just very briefly, because I've mentioned three main issues that I wanted to talk about, is external anchorage. And I know there's been a lot of debate recently with respect to NATO enlargement and the impact that it had on the security landscape in Central and Eastern Europe and on Russia's attitude. But NATO and the EU had a tremendous transformative impact in Central and Eastern Europe. And we really can't ignore that. Of course, we can talk about the limits and the setbacks, but it's clear, and it's clear just by looking at it, we don't need to run any regressions, that citizens are enjoying more prosperity, more freedom, and more peace as a result of integration. Now, Ukraine offers a very chilling mirror to the countries in Central and Eastern Europe in terms of what poor government and governance can lead to in the absence of integration. And unfortunately, this option was not made available to Ukraine. So in the absence of accession prospects, the EU conditionality has had far less traction in Ukraine than in the other countries in the region. And even in their case, the EU is still needed to exert constant pressure for the reforms to be continued. We're still not there yet. So if Ukraine is going to succeed and stay on track with its reform process, it needs Western presence. It needs commitment, and it needs investment of all kinds, from money to expertise, to pressure on politicians, and to support from civil society. And I want to carry that message with every opportunity because I think there's a failure to recognize that aspect. And I think this is one of the most important lessons that we've learned from transitions in Central and Eastern Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Karina, for your very thoughtful remarks. After Russian, Romanian, now back to Ukrainian perspective. Alexander.
Thank you. Let me start from the famous legend, according to which when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, "So you are the little woman who started this great war." I think Mustafa Nayyem can pretend on similar role in the Ukrainian history. As you heard, his post on Facebook was the start of Euromaidan protests, which led to the overthrow of Yanukovych government. So he is the not so little man who started this potentially the great revolution. By the way, Victoria Nuland also can pretend for the role of Harriet Beecher Stowe in Ukrainian history. According to one very, very independent American website, Victoria Nuland will probably enter the history as a person who instigated the start of civil war in Ukraine. And a few days ago, one notorious pro-Russian activist, recalling the famous Victoria Nuland's visit to the Maidan 1 year ago, wrote, "It was American cookies of Nuland that have launched bloodshed in Ukraine. It was a year ago. But this was not enough for Obama, and America, with its puppet regime in Kyiv, without declaring war, attacked the Ukrainian people." Of course, there is no need to comment on these ridiculous allegations. With all my respect to both Mustafa Nayyem and Victoria Nuland and to their role in contemporary history, I still think that the events in Ukraine that have occurred during last year have deeper roots. Even if Mustafa had written nothing on Facebook, the Maidan would occur, and even if Victoria Nuland had never visited Ukraine, Russia would provoke a war. I'd like to recall that democratic transformations in Ukraine began long ago in the time of Gorbachev's perestroika. So we had almost 30 years of democratic transition, but still don't have a full-fledged democracy in Ukraine. Moses led his people through the desert for 40 years until the last person who remembered slavery died. Maybe this term is necessary for changing public consciousness. So if this is correct, maybe in some 10 or so years, we finally will have a real democracy and rule of law in Ukraine. It will happen when the older generation, my generation, educated in Soviet Union, as you heard, I graduated from the university in 1986, when we'll go away from the leading position, and the generation of Mustafa Nayyem, the generation for whom freedom is natural environment, take a leadership role in our society. Of course, we can be confident about the future of democracy in Ukraine if the new generation of politics consists only or mostly of the people like Mustafa Nayyem. But is it really so? Adam Michnik said that the worst thing about communism is that what comes after, right? Yes. And I want to recall that the values of this generation began to form in 1990s, a period which a year ago was considered the most difficult period in modern Ukrainian history. We did not know then that the most difficult period is still ahead of us. This generation lived through the times of economic decline, mass poverty, growth of organized criminality, and therefore mass disappointment with independence and democratic values. This generation grew up in the society where corruption was a usual thing, where the words about democracy contrasted sharply with authoritarian practices of Kuchma and Yanukovych administrations and local authorities, where people were used to conform to circumstances rather than actively change them. I believe that the burden of the past that all generations of the Ukrainians bear is the biggest threat to democracy in Ukraine, perhaps even bigger than the current war. Will the new generation be able to make Ukraine democratic society, having this experience? There are good reasons to hope that it will. This was proved by the Orange Revolution and by the last revolution, which is called the Revolution of Dignity, or simply the Maidan Revolution. The new generation, or more precisely its most active part, proved its ability to organize itself to protest and to overthrow undemocratic government. However, it has not yet proved its ability to build a new society. I'd like to remind that revolution in sociological sense is not only an overthrow of the old regime and establishing a new one, but rather a process of rapid and profound social transformation as a result of the change of power. Street actions and the change of power are only a necessary introduction to radical changes in political and economic system and in social structure that in fact distinguish real revolution from the so-called revolution. From this perspective, I think it's too early to say that the Ukrainian democratic revolution has won. Its main events are yet to come, if they come at all. Ukraine really needs systemic changes, no matter whether we call them a revolution, a radical reform, or rebooting the country. Otherwise, the civilization gap between us and the developed part of the world can become irreversible. Have we achieved the goals for which the Maidan fought? Over a year ago, at the midst of the Maidan protests, I wrote an article entitled "For What Revolution?" Let me modestly quote the text in a very rough translation from Ukrainian. To break this corrupt system, to turn the country to the European way of development, to make up for lost years of the so-called reforms on the clan oligarchic model, these are the main goals of the new Ukrainian revolution, if it is really a revolution. It should be a democratic revolution against the authoritarian oligarchic regime for the democracy of European pattern, a social revolution against the corrupted oligarchic capitalism for socially oriented market system, an economic revolution of the independent and socially responsible business against the monopoly of the so-called family and the oligarchs close to it, a national revolution against the economic and political dependence from Kremlin imperialism and against the anti-Ukrainian forces in power, and finally a spiritual revolution against the remnants of the so-called Sovok, that is Soviet in the bad sense mentality in our own minds, for establishing a European system of values. And today, looking back, I see tangible results only in one of these aspects, namely in the national revolution. The anti-Ukrainian forces have been removed from power. We have unprecedented level of national unity now, if not to take into account the separatist enclave in the Donbass, and we have a real political independence from the Kremlin, although we still don't have an economic independence. But even these achievements are endangered by the war, because if Ukraine loses the war, it would be an end of both real independence and democracy. If we look at other aspects, we can see that the changes are occurring too slowly, not to mention the economy and social sphere, where the real reforms even haven't started. I'm not an expert in the field of democratic transition, so I have no ready-made recipes how to do it. I know only one thing. Democratic revolution is measured neither by radicalism of street protests, nor by the number of dismissed officials of the old regime, but by the depth of systemic changes in society that it causes. Over the past 25 years, Ukraine has experienced 3 democratic revolutions. If the current revolution ends only by the change of personalities at power, or just comes to naught at the Orange Revolution, Ukraine finally would become similar to those Latin American countries that 50 years ago inspired the aphorism of a prominent American journalist. The more revolutions occur, the less things change. Perhaps in the future we will need fewer revolutions in words but more change in things. And I would like to support Oleg Kozlovsky. Karl Gershman, the president of the National Endowment for Democracy, wrote, "The strategic goal for people who want to see a more peaceful and democratic world is a Russia that, like Ukraine, wants to be democratic and a part of Europe. Right now, such a scenario seems very unlikely, but if Ukraine succeeds, there is the possibility for a better outcome. That is why Ukraine's struggle for democracy, independence, and territorial integrity has consequences for the whole world. And it's why the United States has a profound stake in its success. By standing with Ukraine, we are not merely supporting their struggle. We are also defending our own national security and advancing the values of human freedom that America, with all its troubles, continues to represent." And I want to address these words to all my American friends. And returning to Mustafa Nayyem, we all, I mean the Ukrainians, are responsible for the future of our country. But Mustafa Nayyem has a special responsibility, both because he is a member of the ruling majority in the parliament and because he is the man who started the revolution. I hope the reward he has received will be an incentive for him to fight for democracy and to build democracy even more actively than before. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander, for some very stimulating remarks. So we'll give Mustafa a brief chance to respond, and then we'll go to questions and comments from all of you, to all of the panelists. And if your questions could really focus on some of the domestic internal issues, we'll then have an expert panel that will deal with the international developments. So, Mustafa.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. I think we'll have tough discussion, I hope so. But what I want to say, only one thing on all those comments. You know, I share your disappointment with what is going on now in Ukraine, with those processes that we don't have reforms and etc. But again, I want to stress that situation now we have in Ukraine, it's not results of revolution. Let's be frank with that. It's results of war. Please tell me, could you imagine just a year ago that those people who are now in our government, that they will be elected during Maidan? We should be honest that Mr. Yatsenyuk, Mr. Turchinov, Mr. Poroshenko, Mr. Klitschko, they were not leaders of Maidan. They were not leading those processes. So they were among our people. They were on the stage, but they were not leaders. So, and we can't say that we elected those people, allowed them to be in power just because we made revolution for them. We made revolution for us. But we was forced to leave them in power because we can't do it now. We should be honest with ourselves that our generation, we can't run country during war. We didn't have this experience, but if not war, I'm sure we could find other leaders, other faces, other processes, and etc. So what we have now, this is the result of war. Actually, we elected not only president, but commander-in-chief. Just remember campaign of Mr. Poroshenko. The main motto was, we will stop the war. It was not about reforms. Yes? And when you say that we are changing personalities, we even didn't change personalities. Yes? We know that those politicians who are now, they are young, but they are not new. It is very good that they are success now in running country during war. Because last negotiation in Minsk, you know, a lot of feedback about President Poroshenko, and it's very positive. Because he signed this agreement, we have problem with this agreement, we don't like it, but at least we did this.
and we didn't step down. We didn't give up our position in these agreements. We have the same Minsk agreement we had in September 19th. We should recognize it. We don't like Poroshenko, but he was well at that negotiations. He is well in other things. Now who is the head of Council of Security, yes, Security Council of Ukraine, Mr. Turchinov, he was well during first days of war. You know, I remember first days when I met Mr. Yatsenyuk and Mr. Turchinov, and they told me that we don't have any unit, any unit in country we can move from one side to other side. Any troops, we just didn't have that. When we saw first Ukrainian tanks, it was like fairy tale. We never saw them before during all those 20 years. And now we are planning war. We are defending our country. And it took only 10 months. In country without money, without economy, without support. But we did it. And it's achievement of our leadership. Yes, unfortunately, they are not success in fighting corruption. But again, it's not a result of revolution. We should wait for these results. A new generation, and those who are now new in the parliament, and those who want to help those guys who are fighting on the front line, I think they are results of revolution. For example, I can't imagine now that we will have those processes we had during presidency of Mr. Yanukovych. We have corruption, but it's not so systematic. Yes? We don't have this process when, you know, everyone knows who is Arbuzov, who is Azarov, and we know all links with Arbuzov and Yanukovych, that all cash that we saw in his houses, in their houses and buildings, and we can't do nothing. We couldn't do nothing. But now it's impossible. It's impossible to imagine that some officials in Ukraine publicly will say that, yeah, you know, I have some deals with the son of president. This is changes. They are very little. But my last comment, when I came to journalism, it was 2005. Every day in parliament was starting from announcing of members of parliament who moved from one fraction to other fraction. You know, it was just from communists to Ruch, or etc., something like that. Every day. And it was very ridiculous, but we didn't do nothing with that. In 5 years, when became President Mr. Yushchenko, we changed that. And now we can imagine that some member of parliament, some member of Batkivshina will move to Poroshenko. 10 years. We needed 10 years to change this mentality of our politicians that it's not good. Now, for 3 months, we changed the mentality that you can't vote for someone else. Now we changed that you have to show your declaration. You can't live in big house and say that you're just working for civil service, yes? So this is little changes, but you're right that we should go to the roots. We are now to adopt new legislation about public finances. This is roots. I hope so that we will change it. We are going to reform civil service at all, because we should set up new rules for them, for accountability of those people. I don't think that in 10 years we'll be able to say that, okay, we are a success, but we will do something and we will change it. But okay, it's not so fast as we want before. But we have war. And when you're saying about these examples of Central and Eastern Europe, we should admit two things. First of all, they didn't have war. They didn't have war. Every day in Ukraine, dying people. And it's not something like, you know, it's not something that going there on the front line, going in Kiev, because every day we're thinking about that. And a lot of not very good politicians, they're using this situation. You know about oligarchs who are now in civil service, and they're using this situation saying that we are protecting country, so please let us do what we want. We don't like it, but we should allow them. But we don't have choice. Yes? And the second point we should admit about those countries is that they were supported by Europe, at the territory of Europe. Unfortunately, what we see now in Ukraine, Ukraine geographically, yes, it is Europe. But sometimes I have some doubts that leaders of the European Union, they really think that Ukraine is part of Europe politically. That's why we see those hesitation of European leaders who think to help Ukraine and not to help. We had 10 months of war in our country, and only now we discuss to help Ukraine with lethal weapon or not. Can you imagine that in Poland, that moment? In Hungary or in Bulgaria? No. But we have now in Ukraine. So this is different situation. Unfortunately, we are alone now. Inside the Ukraine. Outside, yeah. Sometimes we can have some assistance, but not inside. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, with that, we'll open it up to your questions and comments. If you could please, in Wilson Center tradition, wait for the microphone and state your name and affiliation. So we'll go to Professor Sorel.
Thank you very much. And first of all, congratulations to you, Mustafa. And as a senior advisor to the prize, we are very, very excited about the fact that two of our awardees, you and Oleg, are here with us today. You are the hope, you are the future for both Ukraine and for Russia. Appreciate your direct and pragmatic approach to what you're doing and your positive thinking that even small incremental gains do matter. The question that were raised by Oleg with his doubts on the accord and by the Corina and Alexander regarding their essential message that what is required is systemic and systematic changes, profound changes. And you're absolutely correct. Ukraine is facing an unprecedented challenge in addition to the transition from communism to democracy, is that war is going on. No other country in the region that after the fall of Berlin, of the wall in Berlin, had to face war. They just transitioned from one form of government to another. Therefore, the question I have for you, and tell us really in detail if you will, how can we help?
Okay. Yeah, let's recognize one thing, that Ukraine can't survive without assistance of United States and Europe. Not because we are weak, not because we are silly, just because the enemy we have is much stronger than we are. All Europe and United States now, they put sanctions on Putin, waiting when he will step down, but he do not. Yes? So we can't wait that Ukraine win this enemy. But if you are helping us, if you are providing us with assistance, but at the same time we understand that Ukrainian political system is not ideal. It has sins. So I think the best way to help us to do what said my colleague Corina, that this should be micromanagement from EU. We need managers from EU to control those money you're providing Ukraine. There's only one way to survive. Why? Because, you know, all Ukrainian politicians, they're patriots. But they are part of this system. They're linked to the system. It is very difficult to be in some position and running some ministry, for example, and have a lot of money and not to steal it. Unfortunately, it's true. It is much easier not to steal if you're a foreigner, because Ukrainians will watch you. And we have these examples. You know, the Minister of Finance of Ukraine is Mrs. Yaresko. We have Deputy Minister of Internal, Ekes Guladze, Minister of Economy, and etc. And those are foreigners who are really can help us. And I'm sure they will be able to fulfill some gaps in experience, in those traditions, which we don't have. So my advice to you is just money, it's just part of assistance. But you should control those money, how they're spending, and you should have these deadlines for this money. Because, for example, now we adopted the Ukrainians' budget for this year. For me, it's obvious that it was political decision of our government because we needed to fulfill requirements of IMF. And it was political requirements and political decision of IMF. But it is just business plan, you know? It doesn't mean that we will fulfill this business plan. But we adopt it. And now who will control this budget? Now our governments tell us that, you know, we should change this budget again. And we see that we have very terrible situation with our currency, with the hryvnia. And we are not to fulfill our budget these 3 months. So my idea is that if we will have these managers a little bit, maybe not high ranked by this middle management, maybe there will be engine of changings, and then new generation will follow them, because there are a lot of new people now in government who really works for just because they want to change something. Let's hope they will be persistent for long term. Yes, example, our parliament, you know, the salaries of member of parliament, it's not joke, but it's true that a lot of people now in parliament, they're living just for salary, and it's very hard. But they want to do, they have ambitions, and we should support them. Support them with this management, not only with money. Thank you.
If you like to comment on this?
Maybe I add some words. I think that the moral support also is very important, and in this sense, the clear prospect, if we say about the how the West can support Ukraine, the clear prospect of European Union membership for Ukraine in the future is very important for us. Of course, for that we should make great efforts toward economic, social, and political democratic reforms to meet European Union standards. We cannot demand that the European Union guarantees that Ukraine will become a member of the European Union, but we expect European Union readiness to admit Ukraine if it fulfills conditions necessary for membership. And I think that the prospect of European Union membership is an important incentive for Ukraine to reform.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I just one quick comment. I totally agree with you. And I hope there are representatives of Central and Eastern European countries in the room, and maybe I would have a question for them. Something I found very interesting since the beginning of the crisis in Ukraine with the Maidan protests and now with the war in Eastern Ukraine, I have seen very little signs from the 10 Eastern European EU countries, signs of solidarity towards Ukraine. And I don't just mean speeches and diplomatic efforts and probably providing expertise or some money from NGOs. I mean aggregate solidarity, aggregate action at the level of the EU, pushing for a common policy or a common approach for Ukraine. And that is quite surprisingly because these countries have been through that period of transition. And I would expect them to be the main advocates for changes in Ukraine and for a more consistent, coherent, and long-term policy towards Ukraine in the European Union. And we have not seen that. And I wonder what is happening with the leadership in Central and Eastern Europe, and what is their take on what is happening in the Ukraine, and what is their responsibility inside the EU in addressing this problem.
It's a really good question, Karina. Thank you. All right. Yes, the gentleman in the center there.
Thank you and congratulations. I wanted to follow up on Dr. Sorrell's question.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
I'm sorry, Garth Trinkle, Independent, Washington, D.C. I wanted to follow up on Dr. Sorrell's question as to what we could do in the West and Japan and Australia to help the generation 35 years and younger. I ask that because whereas I think this is the right size panel for a short 90-minute session. I think it would have been helpful to have had Moldova, Belarus, more people from Russia, different parts of Russia, different parts of Ukraine are represented, West and Central, but people from Eastern Ukraine, people from Crimea, people from the different parts of Russia. So my question is, do you have any comments on how the West could help the younger generation of the Maidans in Eastern Europe, not moving beyond Central and Eastern Europe, but focusing on Eastern Europe and perhaps Central Asia? Thank you.
Okay, you know, I so many times heard this question, how we can help you in Washington. And, okay, I think that now we need really moral support, first of all. Why? Because unfortunately, we have this situation when those people who made Maidan, they are not in government. I mean, those young people, yes? It looks like this parliament and this government, their transition, it doesn't mean that they're bad or good, but this transition. Next generation of Ukrainian people and Ukrainian young people, I think they should be united somehow. It is very complicated now to find this ideology to unite them, because it is very complicated when you have war to say something not about war. Yes, you know, it's great joke in Ukraine when you're saying about something you don't like. If you don't like it, you can say, we are fighting for Ukraine. And that's enough. If someone blaming you that you corruptioneer, you can say, I'm fighting for Ukraine. If someone blame you that you, I don't know, break some rules on the streets, you can say that you fight for Ukraine. And it's enough. Even if you don't know nothing, you can say that and people will applaud you. And in that situation, it's very hard to deliver people some very pragmatic mottos, pragmatic things. Because two things that we are laughing at now is just patriotism and reforms. Those two words I hate. Because everything in Ukraine used those two words. Everyone, in any process. Yes? But somehow everything we do, it's about reform and about patriotism. So we should use other words. And I think the helpful for us will be if you support those new generation, those new young leaders who are coming here, United States, providing with the knowledge how to build new teams, build new coalitions, build new system of coordinates in which young people can appear in political life. Because now a lot of them are very naive. A lot of them, you know, they're activists yet. I feel it in myself because for me it's very complicated to feel myself as a politician. Sometimes I forget about it. But it's a matter of time. But you can help it. Because, for example, NDI, they have great experience how transform this social mobilization, how convert that to political activity. Because without that, we will have next Maidan. It's obvious. If you do not change now, system, next generation will do Maidan. In 5 years, in 10 years, we don't like this. Yeah, it doesn't mean we don't like Maidan, but it means that we don't want to do the changes that way. So please help us with experience, support us, and push our government to fulfill all those requirements which we signed this coalition agreement we have now, which we signed its agreement with the European Union, because, you know, not all of those requirements are going to be fulfilled.
Yeah, I would add a couple of things. One, regarding especially Russia and maybe to some extent Ukraine, I'm not sure. One thing is, I wouldn't think that just change of generations will solve the problems. because unfortunately the new generation is not unified. We shouldn't think that younger people are necessarily pro-democratic, pro-Western, pure of corruption, etc. Unfortunately, there are many young people who are affected by this neo-Sovietism, who are affected by opportunism, who are involved or would like to be involved in corruption. Let's be clear about that. So, unfortunately, I'm afraid I here would have to disagree with Alexander Zaitsev. It's not enough to just wait for 40 years. After 40 years, you can see the Soviet mentality just regenerate, be restored in maybe a different way. So communism is not trendy anymore in Russia, but the desire to restore a strong state that would induce fear in others is perhaps as strong as it was 20 years ago, or 30 years ago for that matter. On the other hand, there are, of course, many young people who have experience of relatively free life, who have experience of being abroad, of being acquainted with the Western or I don't know, you can call it universal values. And for these people, I think you can do two things. You can support civil society, especially civic education in Eastern European countries. And you can support media, including the internet, to give people more access to information, more access to independent information, and to give them food for thought that will probably lead some of them to better understanding of how democracy works.
Thank you. Jill, and then we'll go to the lady over there.
Hi, Jill Doherty from the Wilson Center. Mustafa, I just wanted to ask you this question. I mean, you're obviously saying that you had to leave the current kind of generation of leaders in place just because it's a wartime situation and you can't change the entire thing right now. But there is a sense of dramatic timing here. And I just wanted to kind of rephrase the question that you almost answered, but to really make it pointed. I mean, time is running out. If there is there enough political will in the government right now and the Rada to carry out the reforms that really have to be carried out? And Mr. Yatsenyuk said that they're going to be very difficult for the IMF. Is there enough political will right now? Because if there isn't, Europe and everybody else could get cold feet and not want to give more money to Ukraine, which has been a problem for, as we know, for years and years. Thank you.
It is a very hard question for me because I'm not in Ukraine. If you were in Ukraine, I would answer you more frank that we don't have this will. But what I want to say, firstly, is that we should remember that those politicians are not new. They can't be changed in 1 year. Mr. Yatsenyuk in our political life is since 2002. He was Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was Minister of Economy of Crimea, by the way. He was Minister of Economy of Ukraine. He was Speaker of Parliament, but he's still young. And we think that he's new guy. He's not new guy. It doesn't mean that he's infected by something, but they're running country the way they know how it was done by Kuchma, Yanukovych, Yushchenko, and etc. They have different values. It's true. We should recognize they have different values. They are for freedom of speech. They are for freedom of assembling. They want to change something, but the way how to do that, they don't know how to do that. They don't know other way. And that's problem. And the second is that, you know,
they are not alone. Now in our country we need really unity and integrity. And when you are going, for example, it's a very simple example, you will understand what I mean. When our Minister of Interior entered to his cabinet, we asked him, please punish those guys who fired people on Maidan, who beat them, and those brutal force who was used against Maidan. And he promised us that he will do that. And I believe he wanted to do that. But what happened after that? At the third day when he came to the cabinet, 3 days in Kyiv we didn't have any militia on the streets. Nothing. No one. And he was responsible for streets. He was responsible for crime on streets. And he came to militia asking them to go out and save this, I don't know, rules on the streets. And they did it. But at the moment he started to prosecute those people, the system was under control. The same things we had on front line. You know that a lot of people who was fighting on Berkut, who was used against people on the streets, I saw them. I met them on the front line. Now they're fighting for Ukraine in Donbass. You know, it's not simple situation. How, for example, just imagine, I met a guy who is the commander of battalion in Artyomovsk. And he told me, I know you. He's Mustafa. You're a journalist. And you started Maidan. And he described me the 22nd of February by hour, what happened on Maidan. He was staying there. But now he's fighting for Ukraine. Just tell what to do with him. Prosecute him? Maybe. But then who will fight? And what is very dangerous for that part of our reforms is that if you are going to prosecute those people, a lot of them will escape, a lot of them will fight against Ukraine, which we had in Crimea. It's not the reason what not to do reforms, it's just example that situation is not simple. The same thing we have with our governor, Mr. Kolomoisky. You know that. This guy, well known among politicians and among journalists for a lot of years. People know who is that guy just 1 year because his name became famous. But now he is governor of Dnipropetrovsk district. And we don't know what can happen if someone will try to resign him. But from the other side, he has 2 citizenship. Openly. He just admitted that. And it's violation of our constitution. And it is well known by president, by prime minister, but we can't do that. We don't know the consequence of this step. And today, it is very hard, but we are trying to achieve these problems. So we don't have this will on the top of this pyramid. And the idea, I think the idea should be, is that, okay, if we don't have this will on the top of this pyramid, we should build some aisles of reforms, and then connecting those aisles, we can build the powerful engine which will do reforms unavoidable. I mean, for example, now we will do these reforms of patrol policemen, you know, in Kyiv, which will be done by Eka Zguladze, who is Deputy Minister of Interior. She's doing this in the middle of this system. I know this process, and I think, I'm sure and convinced it will be a very, very successful reform. It will not change all militia, but this will be aisle in which will be served young people with values, and they will do very good job, by the way, with the assistance of United States and other European structures, and they will change approach of the system. And someday, somehow, those people will be engine of all entire changing of all system, I believe. The same thing we have now in Parliament. The Speaker of Parliament is Mr. Groisman. Yes, he's not, I mean, young or new politicians, yes? And we know those leaders of fractions. We know those old politicians who are now in our parliament. But at the same time, there are 20 or 30 young parliamentarians who will not allow them to broke procedures very openly. This parliament is different just because those people are in this parliament. And it goes to all system. We don't have this will on the top of hill, but we can start it on this middle term, yes? And maybe, I'm sure that next election, because we have next local election, next parliament election, we'll bring those young people to the parliament. You know that Samopomish, this is one of our fractions which consists only from young people. They're very effective. Yes? Maybe next election they will have much more people in their fraction. So that's my question. Let's wait and be persistent and believe that those young people will change it. And it's not about, how old years are they. For example, in our Euro-optimistic young group, we have guys who is 56. And Mr. Chumak, maybe someone who knows him. And we have a lot of other people who is more than 45, 40 years. It's not about how old are you. It's about your values and what you're going to do. And are you persistent with that? That's it.
Thank you. We're quickly running out of time for this session. Let's take 3 very brief questions. We'll go in, first the lady in purple there. Very brief, please, and we'll take all 3, concluding with the ambassador. So.
Eleanor Bachrach. I served with USAID on fiscal reforms from 95 to 2000. Difficult time, but a time of more optimism, both for Ukraine and Russia. You talk about the need, the problems of the oligarchs, the need to overcome their power, and yet you've elected an oligarch president. Does it take a thief to catch a thief, or is this a problem?
Okay. Nikolai Ratiu, down here. Down here. Yep. Sorry, that was
Thank you, Nikolai Ratiu, the president of the Ratiu Family Foundation. As a fellow Euro enthusiast and optimist, young one, I want to congratulate you, and I look forward to giving you the award later at the reception. The build-up to this meeting in Minsk was supposed to have been based on the threat recognized by Putin of both increased European sanctions and or arming of the Ukrainians by the US. Now that there is a so-called peace plan, and both of you talked about, you and Oleg and others have spoken about the inbuilt flaws already. Do you think that either or both of those options should actually now be implemented? Will they be helpful, as in further sanctions and arming of the Ukrainian country?
I would actually suggest that we save the answer for that question for the second panel, and then go to the final speaker. Yeah, right here.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to congratulate. I have Ambassador of Ukraine, Alexander Motsk. First of all, I would like to congratulate Mustafa for his today's award, and I am sure that he will be as brilliant parliamentarian and as he is journalist, and he already has been proving that he's really great parliamentarian. Second, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Wilson Center for paying attention to Ukraine in this quite complicated time for my country. And a couple of remarks. First of all, about Minsk agreements that was signed this morning. Well, we are very cautiously optimistic. But we understand that words of the declaration and of agreement are good, but we also understand that these will be deeds that will show how those agreements will be implemented. And in this context, we highly appreciate support by United States and by European Union. We wish that support to increase in the future, and we wish the unity of United States and European Union be very solid in the future as well. On sanctions, sanctions have been working, and we urge United States and European Union to continue with that issue and not to think at this stage about the repelling some sanctions at all. And just to maybe to conclude, Ukraine has been now defending not only itself but also Europe and European values, and that means that it is business, quote unquote, for not only Ukraine but the whole international community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. That's actually a perfect transition to the next panel. So I would encourage Mustafa to respond to the question about the oligarchs, and then we'll take a quick break and then really have a wonderful panel. Much more with we will hear much more from Mustafa, and a panel chaired by this institution's preeminent expert on Ukraine, my colleague Matt Rojansky. So, quick response on the oligarchs.
Forget the question. Maybe someone remind me. Just.
You've elected an oligarch president.
Oh yeah.
So how do you
Yes. Yeah. No, it's. How do I feel with that, or what?
How do you reconcile this with the need to overcome the
You know, the question is that, okay, I would say that Poroshenko, it's not classical oligarch, okay? I will explain why. Because this guy were in political system during a lot of years. I mean, from 2000 years to 90, I don't know, for ages. But, and what is true is that I will say something that I can say these words to him personally and to those people who are against him. It doesn't mean that I like everything he do, but two things I'm convinced. First, this guy is for our country. He is patriot. Not all politicians in Ukraine who call them patriots feels the same emotions like Petro Poroshenko feel about situation in east part of Ukraine. I saw it personally, and you can saw it during his press conference and etc. You see that these guys, this is his own pain. He feels that his own pain. First, and the second, and I'm convinced that too, that Petro Poroshenko is not going to earn money on his position of president. Those two things, for me, it's obvious. At the day when I will be disappointed with those, either one or the other, I will say, okay, it's not my president. But today, I'm convinced on those two things. It doesn't mean we don't have corruption. But I'm sure that this guy on his display, he's not earning money. So for me, yes, he is so oligarch, yeah, because we should recognize he had money and he was involved in political life. But he is not Akhmetov, he is not Kolomoisky, he is not even Firtash, yes. And so maybe it's not the best choice for us, but we don't have other menu. Yes, we have only this menu. And this menu we had Mr. Leshko, Timoshenko, Mr. Yatsenyuk, and Poroshenko. And we elected Poroshenko. So that's the answer of our people. It's not my answer. That's it.
Thank you. Thanks to all four speakers, and congratulations again. Mustafa will resume in 15 minutes. There's coffee outside, but you cannot bring it inside this room. Thank you.